Ni hao, and welcome to episode 6 of my Maos China vlog. Last time you'll remember that we were talking about Mao's earlier agricultural policies between 1949 and 57 and the progress that it had made towards making China into, agriculturally at least, a more communist state by taking private farming and communizing it, collectivizing labour and by the state takeover of land. And now by the mid 50s, that process had been pretty much complete. And although production hadn't improved hugely, it had improved a bit, and Mao thought things were going well enough to think about the next stage of development. And this next stage were communes. He hoped that communes would increase both agricultural and industrial production. He called this, in his phrase, walking on two legs, to increase both of them at the same time. The idea of communes was that they would be the size of about 5,500 households. So the biggest collectors so far had been about 200 to 300 households. Apparently, in China, an average household at this time would have been about 5 people. So you're looking at sort of 25,000 ish people in each commune. The first commune was named Sputnik and was founded in July 1958 in Henan in honor of the Soviet satellite. And this policy led to 750,000 collectives becoming 26,000 communes over the next couple of years, containing 120 million households. About 99% of peasants were in these communes. Within the communes, Mao hoped that they would become self-sufficient and that the standard of living of people should rise. So this is a policy put into place with good intentions and good kind of hopes for the future. And the idea was that women would be freed, for instance, from childcare by the provision of creches and schools, and they'd have less domestic work to do because there would be mess halls where everyone ate together. Grandparents would be freed from the tyranny of looking after their grandchildren and therefore able to rest and relax or contribute to society in different ways. But overall, it was a disaster. People didn't want to live like this, and they didn't appreciate being forced to live like this. Parents who had been freed from childcare instead had to work long hours, and women were expected to do much more physical work than in the past. Eating in mess halls was kind of okay in terms of the food, but it wasn't great for spending time together as a family. And in fact, that's probably part of the communist intention, was to break down those bourgeois domestic arrangements. Mao saw that production wasn't increasing, and when he saw that, he blamed vermin for that, famously, and began the Four Pests campaign against rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows, and made the peasants do various things, but the most famous of that is to bang pots and pans together so that sparrows would be frightened away from landing and would fly around until they were exhausted and drop dead. And because the peasants were in a position where they had to do what they were told to, they, of course, did this, and this led to sparrowcide, which sounds amusing but really isn't if you think about it. And the problem with this whole thing about the Four Pest campaign is, as often the case with Mao's ideas, that although they kind of had a sort of semi-logical beginning, actually when they were played out, they led to much worse consequences than had ever been foreseen. The sparrows, of course, have been eating insects, and rather than destroying the crops, they were in many ways saving the crops from these plagues of other insects that were later came along and destroyed them. So sparrowcide is a good example of Mao meddling in agriculture without really understanding what he was getting into. In this time as well, private farming was abolished, so there was no more private ownership of land. All animals had to be shared with the commune, and the sale of private produce was seen as evidence of rural capitalism, so all private markets were banned, and each commune put together a militia to enforce these rules. And across China, internal passports were given to each peasant so that you couldn't move about from commune to commune or move from village to village without having your internal passport stamped and without the approval, therefore, of the Communist Party. So the communists were another way of controlling the people. For all these reasons, the people were less excited about the work they were doing. We'll come back to the consequences of that in a minute after we've mentioned another great hero of Mao's agricultural policy, and that is Trofim Lysenko. Trofim Lysenko was a Soviet agrobiologist. He's referred to in some of the books as a pseudo-scientist, someone who pretends to be a scientist but isn't. And he said that his techniques would mean that rice and wheat yields would increase 16 times over. And 1958, Mao made Lysenkoism the official policy of the People's Republic of China. These were policies such as the idea that planting seeds leads to X amount of growth, but if you plant them twice as many in a field, you'll get twice as many crops at the end of the year. Which sounds kind of logical, but actually doesn't work at all. And the idea that ploughing churns up the soil, the topsoil is turned over, and the nutrients come to the top. But if you ploughed deeply and churned up soil from a greater depth, you would churn up more nutrients. Again, it sounds logical, but it just isn't true. These techniques were employed without critical review and unthinkingly by the Chinese authorities and imposed upon the peasants. And they, alongside peasant disaffection, helped create the Great Famine from 1959 or 58 through 59 and up to 1962. Harvest levels, in fact, peaked in 1958 with 200 million tonnes of grain being harvested across China. 170 million tonnes were harvested in 1959 and then 144 million in 1960. So that the 1960 harvest was only 72% of what it had been 2 years before. This doesn't seem like a complete disaster, but the truth of the harvest was that it varied hugely from region to region. In some parts of China, particularly that sort of middle, if you divide China into top, middle, and bottom stripes across the country, the middle stripe across the country was particularly badly affected by other external factors, as well as the Lysenkoism and party meddling and by peasant disaffection. Party cadres were reluctant to tell the truth about the harvest, and so that the knowledge of what was going on filtered upwards very slowly. So that land was even left fallow, empty for a year, to rest for a year, in the mistaken belief that actually, if you planted all the land out in China, there'd be too much food to store. And some food was sent abroad as free gifts to communists in other countries, because again, there was this belief that they'd had record harvests and that therefore they had extra left over to give. In fact, they were entering the worst famine of the 20th century. It was particularly bad, as I said, in those central provinces, so that we reckon that 8 million people starved to death in Anhui province, Anhui, 7.8 million in Henan, Henan, 9 million in Sichuan, which is Sichaun, and 1 million in Tibet, which doesn't sound that huge, but in fact is a quarter of the population. And in Tibet, the whole thing is made a lot worse by deliberate Chinese Communist Party policies. In 1959, there was a Tibetan uprising against the Communist Party. And as a consequence of that, the Communist Party were particularly strident in the policies that they wanted to introduce there in terms of agriculture. So they made them plant wheat and maize instead of barley, which had been traditionally planted there. They also stopped the yak farmers of Tibet being nomadic and moving around looking for grazing. And in both cases, these things were disastrous for the yak population and also the yield of crops that was produced, leading to a quarter of the people dying in Tibet. Anyone caught stealing food across China could be sentenced to death. People ended up eating frogs, worms, tree bark, anything that they could put their hands on in order to survive. There was even reports in some places of cannibalism and in other places of people, women selling themselves or being sold into prostitution in order to raise some money, in order to somehow get a hold of some food. The situation was made worse by bad flooding in southern China and by drought in Shandong. and worse, but not caused by. But those things certainly contribute in the bigger picture. In the end, an estimated between 30 and 50 million people died in the Great Famine as a total. We're not sure of the numbers, partly because people weren't going around registering all the numbers, and partly because numbers that come out of Mao's China are not always believed. So the lower end would be more of an official estimate, and the upper end would be more of a Western reflection upon the numbers that we get. But 50 million is often touted as being the figure. Mao blamed the weather, which was contributed a little bit, and local officials who certainly made things worse and meant that there weren't policies to intervene quickly. But if you remember, in 1957, the 100 Flowers campaign had very clearly said that Mao's word was law, and he wasn't going to take criticism. And so the local officials were in a position where they were unwilling to confront Mao. Mao also blamed peasants for hoarding grain, which was complete rubbish. After the Great Famine, Mao does take a step back and removes himself from the day-to-day running of China, and Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping step in and take over control of these policies. Liu Shaoqi, Liu is his name, and you can call him that, Liu, and Deng Xiaoping, Deng. They are much more pragmatic. They say that agriculture is the foundation of the economy. They reduced the size of the economy, the communes. They allowed peasants to have small private plots. They sent insecticides and fertilizers and tools to farms, and allowed the peasants themselves to decide what they could grow, what fertilizers they would use and how much. And they also allowed them to sell food at market, so that by 1965, agriculture production had recovered to pre-Great Leap Forward levels. And that is really the picture of agriculture under Mao up to the Cultural Revolution. And it's a picture in this half really of further change, but in the end, going back to, or in these sort of early 60s, going back to a slightly more pragmatic capitalist approach. If you studied Soviet Russia, it's more of an NEP end than the communes had been before. In terms of success, it's very difficult to pick successes out of this second half because of the Great Leap Forward and the famine that goes with it, meaning that millions of people are starving to death. So there really aren't many successes that you'd pick out here. And if you are going to pick out successes, or if you're asked about successes and want or change and want to pick on positive change, you probably need to look at Liu and Deng's reforms as part of that. I hope that's helpful. It's kind of halfway through our economy double bill now, and the next couple of episodes we'll be looking at industry and seeing what the parallel journey of industry is there. And bear in mind that your questions that you might get could either focus on agriculture or could focus on the economy, which would include both agriculture and industry, or maybe explicitly one part of time in that, or the probably the earlier or the later periods. We'll try and deal with that as we go in the industry bit, and I'll see you next time.